talking. I'm very excited to announce our next panelists. Just a quick show of hands. How many of you work with non-lawyers? So all of you, basically. Well, that's what we try to do at this forum, is to try to bring some non-legal perspectives as well. And it's, we're lucky here that our next speaker has both the legal and the business side of experience. And we can tell from the previous conversation that AI is certainly at the top of mind for business leaders. But there's more. And what is that? I'm very excited to bring our next panelists to the stage to actually find out what are business leaders looking forward to in 2025. Please join me in welcoming them.
Okay. Wonderful. So thanks, everybody. I'm really excited to be here and joined by Kristin. We are going to talk for 30 minutes in this fireside chat about you, my friend. So good morning. My name is Robin McIntosh by way of introduction. I'm currently CEO, co-founder of a company called Avela Health, and we've been working all year in stealth on an autism care company. And then prior to this, CEO, co-founder of Work at Health. And I'm like scanning the room looking for my attorneys because we worked with a lot of counsel over the years. So I'm so excited to have this conversation. And of course, I'm joined by Kristin, who joined Lyft in 2012 as general counsel and went on to become president of business affairs. Is that right?
President of Business Affairs and then President.
President of Business Affairs, just a informal stopover.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and then leading Lyft through regulatory challenges, an IPO, a pandemic, and then through our recent market conditions. So just this phenomenal career. So please join me in welcoming Kristin to the stage. So I really wanted to start with you telling your story, but I would love to hear for everybody in the room just the beginning days of Lyft. So how did you decide to jump from, being from counsel to their in-house counsel and grow this team? Like, what was that decision like? And tell us about those early days.
Yeah, so this is back in 2012, and if the folks who are local here will remember, the Lyft product at that time was limited to San Francisco and not a lot of cars on the road, but the cars that were on the road had the big pink fuzzy mustaches. So anyone who's here then will remember those. They're still iconic to this day, even though that hasn't been part of the brand forever. So my story was that I had been outside counsel to the company in its actual previous iteration, which was Zimride, a long-distance carpooling platform. And at the time that the co-founders were talking about transporting the Zimride product onto mobile, the concept was called Zimride Instant originally, before they settled on the catchier name of Lyft. They had me there with them in the boardroom as their outside counsel to say, hey, Kristin, is this legal? Can we do this? And that was about 6 months before I ended up joining them. And at the time, my answer was sort of like, well, there's not laws on the books that contemplate this. So it's hard to say that it's strictly legal, but I also think that the laws on the books are so far afield that we can make an argument that we are an entirely new category, that we're not prohibited from operating because of the laws that exist today. And so I ended up joining them full-time in fall of 2012 because it was the opportunity of a lifetime to work on what I knew then would be disruptive, interesting, and challenging. What I didn't know was whether the company would survive as a long-term going concern. I knew that I might have a job for like a year, and I was fully prepared to take the leap and go back into private practice to the extent that it just didn't work out.
Right, absolutely. I wish, I can't tell you how many times I asked our lawyers, is this legal at the beginning of building Work at Health, which is telepsychiatry. So, it's just an interesting place to be in because you have to match the big world vision and the risk appetite of early founders to what is legal and good corporate, governance. And I think part of the story is understanding how large something is going to get. So did you know at that time when you were looking forward that Lyft had this possibility? Like, how did you think about setting up some of that rule book, right? Like,
Yeah.
did you know about did you foresee an IPO, and did you think about creating governance that accommodated each scenario?
I totally did not foresee an IPO, and I totally did not foresee the scale that the ride-sharing industry would eventually grow to. What I did know, though, in those few months that the product had been in operation prior to me joining the company, was that there was incredible product market fit, like nothing I'd ever seen as outside counsel before, in terms of just incredibly stellar demand. And so that was really exciting to me. And I knew that we already had the regulators, the California Public Utilities Commission, CPUC, interested in Lyft and the ride-sharing industry more broadly. And so as far as thinking about good governance, I definitely didn't have like the sort of IPO crystal ball in mind, but I also knew that, you know, the very clear and present thing was making sure that we, A, operated in a way that was safe, that would encourage customers to keep coming back again and again, and that, B, was not counter to what the regulators were trying to achieve, which was healthy and safe competition in terms of transportation options for, at that time, San Franciscans, and obviously later, many more geolocalities. And so, so a lot of the things that we put in place in those early days as far as good governance, things like insurance and background checks for drivers, were not because they were mandated or foisted upon us. It was because we knew that this was the way to position ourselves as a trusted option for consumers and as a trusted partner to regulators.
Right, right. And you were working with relatively young founders and team, right?
Yeah.
I remember the early days. I mean, hence the mustaches. We
Yes.
didn't do that.
Our co-founders were in their late 20s. I was not that much older myself, but I was older than them a couple years. And so there was definitely a lot of like educating and professional growing up that had to happen as well. And you know, we were all figuring this out for the first time, but I think that was part of what made it a really interesting challenge, was that there wasn't like some secret rule book on what to do. It had to be a meeting of the minds from multiple folks as far as risk alignment with business opportunity.
Right, and I would imagine, how did you navigate sort of their large appetite? So at the beginning when you were building a team, right? Like, because you probably built this large team under you in the first 5 years, and then, you know, including, but I think it's difficult to be in the room as, not the whistleblower, that's the wrong word for it, but the adult in the room, especially being so young, you know? Like, so I think that rub is really interesting. You know, you don't usually see that role survive at a company for so long. So how did you engender enough trust? And how did you teach your team to do the same thing? How did you not be the bad guy every step of the way?
I love that question. Well, I guess first and foremost, I was lucky in that I had built a relationship with the co-founders as outside counsel for a couple of years. So I had already at least sort of earned that base of trust in terms of they knew that I was exercising judgment, and that I wasn't just going to say no every time, that I would think really critically about whatever it was they wanted to do in the moment and help them achieve an answer versus shut down X idea on the spot. So I think the pre-existing relationship definitely helped. I guess a couple other things. One is that I didn't build a large team right away. I had like no budget. We were a tiny company. We were a Series B company. So it was just me for a year. And then I think the second year it was like one other person. And it was only a few years in that I really was able to build out the legal team, which today is like a little under 200 folks total, attorneys and support staff. So it ultimately became like running its own law firm, but in the early days, it was just me in the room. And so, one of the principles that I really lived by, and that I think my team was great at embodying too, was that like no should never be, almost never should be your first answer. I mean, if something is blatantly criminal, okay, fine, say no. But if something is really risky, but does have some benefit, you really owe it as a lawyer to your clients to peel apart the layers of whatever is being suggested in that moment. And I think the Lyft legal team is great at this too, so they will help the business partners think creatively about perhaps achieving like a different path to the solution that they're looking for, but they're not going to come out the gate and say no.
Right. Yes, absolutely. I have so many more questions, but I want to keep the conversation moving forward because we have these really big events that happened. So I think next up was IPO, right? And that's kind of the be-all, end-all, the best thing that could happen to a startup like Lyft and like its mustache startup to IPO. It's such a great story. So can you talk to us a little bit about that experience? And what year was that, 2019?
It was 2019, yeah. So I had been general counsel for, I guess, six-ish years at the time that we were really starting to think seriously about going public. And for multiple years before that, it had been kind of a scary prospect to me as general counsel because I just felt like we didn't have the maturity as a company. But thankfully, in those intervening years, we'd hired a really great CFO who he and I are still close, just had coffee together a couple weeks ago. And so I think he and I were able to work together to really mature the processes of the business, because when you're in-house counsel, you got to think deeply about not just can you go public, but should you go public, and are you ready to comply with your quarterly obligations after the act of going public? I think for a lot of folks, it feels like, oh, it's this one big day. But when you are running a company, it is every day and every quarter thereafter. And so the process was a super interesting one. As a company that was heavily regulated, had a lot of litigation, a lot of legal issues, I think we may have done more diligence calls than like any other company that's ever gone public, or close to it. The gig economy in general is just like heavily scrutinized. And at that time, there was a lot of legal overhang related to gig worker status, for example, in the state of California, some of which has been resolved in the years since IPO, but at that time was very much unresolved. And so, understandably, our underwriters really wanted to get deep in the facts. And so I had a massive team working on the IPO, and it wasn't just corporate counsel as it is usually, I think, in-house. It was privacy attorneys and litigators and employment counsel and myself, and that was what it took to get it done. So
amazing.
From an attorney's perspective, it was, I think, as satisfying of an IPO as one could have worked on. And I remember one of my colleagues called it like the Super Bowl for lawyers, because it's one of the only times you get to sort of stand out there and say, like, look at all the work that I've done.
Right.
Because other than that, a lot of the work is in the background.
Yes, of course. It's kind of thankless in a way.
Not thankless.
Maybe that's the wrong word.
It's not thankless, but it can be adversarial, as you referred to earlier,
right.
And it can be unpopular,
right.
And it can be hidden. And sometimes the best work that you do is the work that no one ever finds about because it's preventing something bad from happening. Right. So like this is one of the moments when you're able to stand out there and say, like, we did this,
right.
And be really proud of it. And that does not come around very often.
That does not come around very often. Is there anything, just for in this room, I know there's a lot of counsel that works with early companies in these highly regulated industries. And a lot of the work, by the way, that you did, so I'm saying thank you. A lot of the work that you did carved the pathways for healthcare because it's such a gig economy as well. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of the kind of legislation that was on docket that was, that you were kind of navigating and mining through really affected us in this 1099 economy in a way. So it was really interesting to think about the cross-pollination, and we were in San Francisco too. So, but when you were so I think there's that moment when you're IPOing and the transition from being private to being public, all of your skeletons, on display. I'm just so curious, was there anything that you looked back at those, early years and said, gosh, I wish I had done that differently? Are there any things, just pearls of wisdom that you can give the people in this room who might be looking at the same outcome?
I mean, gosh, so many things, right? You can't work 12
all
years.
of them right now.
Yeah. You can't work 12 years somewhere and think I did every single thing absolutely correctly.
Right.
And I think like, I'll give general categories rather than specific answers, but like, there's definitely some things where I'm like, gosh, I got that risk calibration wrong. I thought this thing, even though I've already talked about trying to be business minded and trying to partner with, product teams, et cetera, there are definitely some things where I felt like, oh, this is a third rail issue. We shouldn't approach it. We can't do this. And lo and behold, especially in the market that we're in, where we have, a very visible competitor, you see your competitor doing something, and you see that it's really working for your competitor.
Yep.
And you as counsel previously advised that we think this thing is really risky. And sometimes those are the right decisions, but sometimes those are the wrong decisions. So I would say, one of the things that was very important to me was being able to revisit decisions a few years after the fact and understand, okay, do we still think this was the right one? Do we think we got it wrong? And if we got it wrong, is it actually such a meaningful error that maybe we want to go back and investigate this line of business or whatever it is? So, generally it would be in the category of being too risk averse, even though I pride myself on sort of not being super risk averse. But those are some of the things that I regret. But gosh, I mean, if you don't look at your career and have some regrets, then like you weren't learning at all. So I don't feel negatively about that. I know that there are things that with more knowledge I would have done differently.
Yeah, and you were comporting yourself in ways that the legislation wasn't there yet.
Exactly.
So you were basically carving up, you were the precedent.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and I mean, look, another thing, I guess on the sort of opposite side, which is like a sort of clear and present issue today, is the industry as a whole is overinsured, and all the companies are spending tons and tons of money on insurance.
Yes.
And that's a big cost issue.
Right.
And it's not inuring fully to the public benefit. And so that's something that the companies are gonna have to try and figure out over the future years. But in the early days, we really wanted to procure a lot of insurance to show the public that, they could count on us to the extent that things went wrong.
Right.
So I don't know that that was like necessarily a wrong decision, but I don't know that it's one that's sustainable, forever and ever going into the future.
Right. Yes, that makes sense. And then, so to put things in context, so you joined Lyft, IPO, and then pandemic, like a year later, and then you shifted as general counsel up to the president role, and then the big president role.
Yeah.
So the two presidencies. But so can you tell us a little bit about those years? Because I'm so curious, in IPO, did you feel better prepared for the pandemic than other companies due to the fact that you had just done an IPO? And you had tightened everything up, et cetera, or?
I do not think we were prepared for the pandemic.
Okay.
I don't know that anybody was, but I don't think that we were. The idea that a year after going public, we could have seen our volume drop by 75% was like in a week. No, we were not prepared for that.
Yes.
And that was really difficult. And look, like after going public, as I sort of alluded to earlier, like going public is just a moment in time, but it's not like the thing. The thing is everything you do afterward. And so we'd already seen a little bit of choppy stock performance, not to the degree that we would have hoped for. And so then, exactly a year later when COVID-19 hits, that was a really scary moment. And within 6 weeks, we were doing a massive reduction in force, and we ended up doing 2 more throughout the course of the pandemic. I think you said you did 3 as well.
3, yep.
And so you're putting people out of work. You're eroding team member trust for the folks who are still around. You need to get a lot done, but you have less people to do it. And in some cases, I should say in many cases, we were losing really good people. So it wasn't like we're laying people off and we didn't miss them. No, we're laying people off, and those are the people who are gonna help us solve some of the really difficult problems. Right. But yeah, so when I stepped into this role, in the President of Business Affairs role in 2021, and that role sort of encompassed a lot of the, call it general administrative functions, the people team, policy, business development. At various points in time, I had comms and marketing, so it was a little fluid, and the responsibilities changed depending on what was going on in the moment. But I would say the people issues in particular really took a front seat because of all of the challenges brought on by the pandemic, poor stock price performance, a scrutiny on elevated stock-based comp figures, et cetera. So there was just like a lot of work to be done. And in some ways, like the work that I had done before didn't at all prepare me for that, other than having a passing familiarity with stock-based comp.
Yeah, in a way, it's almost like starting again in a lot of ways,
Yeah.
right? And especially, I think, I would imagine that the competitor aspect of everything, what they were doing versus you, what they were doing versus you,
Yeah.
all came into play again, right? Like in the pandemic, everybody made different choices, and I think that can be difficult. So yes, let's pivot the conversation to change management. But we talked yesterday about this change management. At least at Work at Health, we went through 3 series of risks. We were on this really steep trajectory. We were growing 400% year over year top line, and then overnight it felt like suddenly the new mandate was take this company into profitability.
Yeah.
And so it took us like 18 months to do it.
And I think the overall expectation from Wall Street changed as well,
completely.
along
Especially-
with all these things.
Yeah, with like the meltdown of, a certain bank and,
Yeah.
et cetera. It was just very difficult. So we were talking, and one of my main jobs became just talking to people about change.
Yeah.
And I remember Googling change management, basic tenets, just really reading like Harvard Business Review's articles like about change management in corporations. And we were about 1,000 people at that time. And so can you talk to us about how you how you navigated that time, but what are some principles you hold dear or you hold as North Stars during a really difficult wartime? Because I think it's different building in wartime than peacetime. And so you were had to build again in wartime conditions.
Yeah, I mean, I think like first and foremost is like the people are everything.
Yes.
And you and I did talk a lot about this, like notwithstanding the fact that we had to do multiple and massive reductions in force, or perhaps especially because of that, the folks that you have left, you have to really wrap in. And that often cannot be through traditional tools like compensation because you don't have extra money to give. That's why you did the reduction in force in the first place. So you have to really establish a new style of leadership where you're bringing people into the fold. You're making sure to be authentic, to be transparent, to hear different points of view. And like you said, frequent communication with employees, like it takes a lot of time, and I think many leaders wish that they didn't have to spend all that time on those things. They wish they were back in their office getting whatever done. But if you don't have the team in place, you kind of can't get anything done. And so spending that time building that trust is critical. And one of the things I do feel proud about at Lyft was that we were able to retain so many people for such a long time. So, when I just left a couple months ago, some of the folks on the legal team, in fact, including the person who took over for me as general counsel, like she's been at Lyft 10 years. A lot of the other folks are 9 years and like have been there through crazy ups and downs. But I think it was because of the care and intentionality that the leadership put into making sure folks felt like they had a real seat at the table and a real point of buy-in. So I think like spending way more time than you think explaining and making sure folks really understand the sausage making as far as whatever it is you're going to do.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So now just kind of, and I want to make sure to leave some time for questions. We can do some questions. Oh, no questions? No questions. Forget it. But we're here, you can ask questions. But okay, so but for the change management, I kind of lost my train of thought with this. But for change management, I wanted to talk a little bit about what happens after, right? Like, so there's the pandemic, and then there are takeaways from the pandemic, and then the rifts, et cetera. And I think the hazard really going through this is becoming too locked down. Actually, before we get into that conversation, would love to hear your global thoughts on governance. Because I think also, at a company like Lyft or a company like Workit, legal, much like clinical in healthcare, but we'll put a clinical aside, but legal kind of should have the last veto power because it's the law, it's regulation, it's legislation, et cetera. So how how does Lyft kind of think about its corporate governance, and where does, I think of legal, but general counsel, or where does counsel sit within the hierarchy of governance and decision making?
Yeah. So one thing that was critical for us, and honestly should be table stakes for everybody, is having the general counsel as a critical member of whatever you call it, the executive leadership team, e-staff, et cetera. I think some folks are like, well, we don't want the lawyer in the room. We'll get more done without them. And I'm coming from an incredibly biased perspective, of course. But in my experience, the longer you leave the lawyer out of the room, the longer it takes things to catch up, and the further along you get with a project, in some cases maybe to a really problematic point, and then you just can't put the brakes on something in the right way. And so, it's really like that old stitch in time saves 9 thing. You get the lawyer in immediately and you get things done. But for us, I guess, continuing the theme of really caring about the people and the stakeholder relationships, having a close working relationship, not just between the CEO and the board, but also between the general counsel and some of the other executive staff on the board, was super important. And so, the folks that sat on Lyft's board, I worked really hard to build a relationship of trust with them, because some of the things that we were bringing to the board were really controversial, major expensive settlements. And, when we supported Prop 22 in California in 2020, it was a major corporate expenditure. And so making sure to build the board's trust so that they understand when you're really going on a limb for something, that you're doing it with reason and with thoughtful purpose versus just sort of asking for money. And so from a governance perspective, I think having that close relationship between the ultimate sort of oversight authority in the board and the executive staff is a really important piece. And then, of course, having the lawyer in the room, as I already talked about.
And did you mentioned the risk aversion at the beginning of your career and time at Lyft being not a hindrance, but something you look back on and think, I could have been more risk-taking, which is a really interesting thing for, I think, a lawyer to say, in a way. So did you feel that way? Did you feel sort of the reverse in the pandemic? Like when you look back, not so much the IPO, but the pandemic, did that risk that, you know what I mean?
I think if you asked me at any point during my career, I would say I take a lot of risk. I think at any point, that's what I would have said. It's more just in sort of the 2020 hindsight, and once you're able to see the way in which things play out through the arc of history, understanding that perhaps a little bit more wouldn't have sunk the company and actually would have propelled the company. But I wouldn't have said that. I wouldn't have given that answer at any specific moment in time. And the way that I always thought about it, which was a piece of advice given to me by a mentor, was I should be taking the biggest, boldest risks in the early days, because they could be the difference between whether the company exists or not. And then, as time went on and we got more funding, or ultimately, of course, went public and had a whole new set of concerns to deal with, I should be taking less and less risk. And so I did, sort of calibrate accordingly over the years. But at every given time, I'm sure I thought I was taking the right amount of risk. It's just, with reflection, you can kind of see where, maybe you could have done something differently.
Right, absolutely. It's incredible, because a lot of those early decisions you made at the beginning seeded, Lyft's existence. They were existential in nature. And that doesn't happen every day. When you go in-house somewhere, you're charting the path. You were a huge part of the IPO and that success.
That was what was such an interesting component of taking on this role, was the idea that I wasn't stepping into a decades or centuries old, well-defined industry and just needing to learn how to execute the playbook that was known for this industry. And that in fact, it was a lot of just kind of good judgment, common sense, how do we think that we should be comporting ourselves? And that then ultimately did become a rule book, because now there's, regulation, legislation all across the US, Canada, and the rest of the world. But I don't know that like the momentousness of that occurred to me on day one.
Right. Yes, I'm sure you weren't like, and this is how I write the future of history.
Exactly.
But how interesting. I think especially given that in this time we're in this market, et cetera, but we're just entering into generative AI, and it's the same story, right? Like the rule book hasn't been written yet, and the companies that are being seeded now and growing now are writing the rule book from 10 years from now, 15 years from now, in ways that will shape the fabric of our lives. And so, and maybe people in this room, right? Like working with AI companies, it's really important. And with Work at Health, we did a lot of work in access and bringing people on board, and the global public to telehealth before the opioid epidemic and before the pandemic. And a lot of the decisions we made became elucidations later by OCR against privacy and et cetera. And you look back and you're like, gosh, that was really formative. So speaking to everyone in this room, as you look forward to the future, Gen AI, it's coming, it's here. Robots shall prosper, But what would you advise, after this decade plus of history in the making?
Yeah, you know what? I mean, I think I don't have any amazing, you'll never hear it again advice on that point. I think what was a couple of things. One, for the folks who are representing companies that are navigating these challenges, I think that comment that I just made about sort of good judgment, common sense, really that is everything when you're writing the rule book for something new. And there was always a tendency for folks to want to take a sort of run around, a shortcut. How do we do things quickly? Do we really have to do X, Y, and Z? And the answer is yes, you got to do those things, because as a company that was, incredibly in the public spotlight, everything we ever did was reported on by every newspaper. And so, I love that sort of sunlight is the best disinfectant approach, where you think about how are you transparent? How are you comporting yourself in a way where you actually can be transparent with the broader public, with businesses, et cetera. And so I think that's one thing that I would say specifically for lawyers who are advising their clients who are grappling with tough issues is they need to figure out the rule book that they can stand behind, that they're not going to be worried about the decisions that they made coming to light. They need to be proud of those decisions. As far as generative AI, I haven't had time to become an expert in it. And that is actually one of the things that I'm so excited to do a deeper dive in, because absolutely it is here. And it's going to change everything. And I think what's interesting right now in the space more broadly is there's still a lot of kind of smoke and mirrors happening with the capability of a lot of tools today. But that's changing so rapidly that some of that smoke and mirrors is absolutely going to be reality tomorrow.
Right.
And that's what's really exciting for me as I think about my next challenge.
Oh, I hope you go into that, and I want to see what you do. I just think it's fascinating. And so just to recap a little bit, so talking through everything, it sounds like transparency is one broad takeaway, common sense, good judgment, going back to first principles.
Exactly.
I hear you say that quite a bit. And then, of course, driving alignment with people.
Yeah.
So many of these companies are about people, and we forget that. But yes, so thank you so much. I know that we have 2 minutes left. Is there anything that you want to tell this esteemed audience?
No, just such a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much. And thank you, Robin. It was so great to get to know you in this process as well.
Oh, yeah. I'm a super fan. So thank you for the time. Thanks, everyone.